The Texas wind carried the scent of blood and sage across the endless prairie, where decisions made in a heartbeat could echo through generations. The year was 1868, and the frontier stretched like an unforgiving sea between civilization and the wild heart of Comanche territory. In 7 days, a choice made by one woman would determine whether peace or war would consume the borderlands forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pre-dawn darkness clung to the weathered cabin like a shroud, broken only by the golden glow spilling from the windows of what served as the most unlikely medical practice in all of West Texas. Dr. Sarah Mitchell pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to ease the exhaustion that had become her constant companion since establishing her practice in Cedar Ridge 3 years earlier. At 28, she had already seen more suffering than most people encountered in a lifetime, but the endless stream of wounded settlers, cavalry soldiers, and displaced families never seemed to diminish. Cedar Ridge perched on the edge of nowhere, a collection of hastily constructed buildings that served as the last outpost of American civilization before the vast Comanche hunting grounds stretched toward the horizon. The settlement existed in a state of perpetual tension, its inhabitants caught between their desire for expansion and their fear of the native warriors who viewed their presence as an invasion of sacred ancestral lands. Sarah had come to this remote corner of Texas not by choice, but by necessity. 3 years earlier, she had been Dr. Sarah Mitchell of Boston, one of only 12 women to graduate from the New England Female Medical College, an institution that existed despite rather than because of societal approval. Her medical training had been rigorous and comprehensive, covering everything from surgical procedures to pharmaceutical preparation, but nothing in her formal education had prepared her for the realities of frontier medicine. The journey from Boston to Texas had been prompted by scandal rather than adventure. Dr. James Morrison, her mentor and the man she had planned to marry, had been discovered conducting illegal medical experiments on indigent patients at Massachusetts General Hospital. When Sarah had attempted to expose his unethical practices, Morrison had used his influence to destroy her reputation, spreading rumors that she was mentally unstable and professionally incompetent. Facing the choice between social ruin in Boston or a fresh start in the wilderness, Sarah had chosen the unknown. She packed her medical instruments, her precious collection of pharmaceutical supplies, and her determination to practice medicine according to her own ethical standards. The trip west had been harrowing, involving riverboat passages, wagon trains, and finally, a solitary journey by horseback to reach Cedar Ridge, where the previous doctor had died of typhoid fever, leaving the community desperately in need of medical care. The cabin that served as both her home and medical practice had been constructed by the town's residents as an inducement to attract a replacement physician. It consisted of 2 main rooms, a front area equipped as an examination and treatment space, and a rear room that served as her living quarters. The examination room contained a sturdy wooden table for surgical procedures, shelves lined with bottles containing various medications and herbal preparations, and a collection of medical instruments that represented the most advanced surgical technology available. Sarah's medical practice differed significantly from the typical frontier doctor's approach. While most practitioners relied heavily on amputation, bleeding, and mercury-based treatments, Sarah had studied more progressive medical techniques that emphasized cleanliness, careful observation, and the body's natural healing processes. She had also taken the time to learn about native medicinal plants from Martha Clearwater, an elderly Cherokee woman who had married a white trader and possessed encyclopedic knowledge of herbal remedies. The combination of formal medical training and indigenous healing knowledge made Sarah uniquely effective at treating the various ailments and injuries that plagued frontier communities. Broken bones from construction accidents, gunshot wounds from conflicts with raiders, childhood diseases that swept through settlements with devastating efficiency, and the psychological trauma that seemed to affect everyone who lived on the edge of civilization. Her reputation for medical skill had spread throughout the region, attracting patients from settlements dozens of miles away. Cattle ranchers brought injured cowboys for treatment. Cavalry officers sought her expertise for battlefield wounds, and families traveled for days to bring sick children to the only doctor they trusted to save their lives. But Sarah's success came with complications that extended far beyond medical challenges. Cedar Ridge existed in a state of constant alert due to its proximity to Comanche territory. The Comanche people, led by war chiefs like Quanah Parker and Buffalo Hump, had been engaged in an increasingly violent conflict with American settlers and military forces. Treaties had been signed and broken repeatedly, creating a climate of mutual distrust and sporadic warfare that made daily life unpredictable and dangerous. The local cavalry garrison, commanded by Colonel William Harrison, maintained an uneasy peace through a combination of diplomatic negotiation and military intimidation. Harrison was a veteran of the Civil War who understood that the conflict with the Comanche could not be resolved through military force alone. But he also faced pressure from territorial authorities to protect American settlers at any cost. Sarah's position in this volatile environment was particularly delicate. As a medical professional, she had taken an oath to treat all patients regardless of their background or circumstances. This ethical commitment had occasionally put her at odds with local authorities when she provided medical care to individuals who were considered enemies of the settlement. 2 months earlier, she had treated a young Mexican vaquero who had been shot while allegedly stealing cattle from a local ranch. The ranch owner, Marcus Brennan, had demanded that Sarah refuse treatment until the man confessed to his crimes. Sarah had ignored the demand and saved the vaquero's life, discovering in the process that he had been shot while trying to recover his own stolen horses. The incident had created tension between Sarah and certain members of the community who believed that medical care should be conditional on political loyalty. Colonel Harrison had supported her decision, but warned that her reputation for treating anyone who needed help could eventually create problems that neither of them could solve. That warning proved prophetic on a windswept October morning when Sarah was awakened by frantic pounding on her cabin door. She emerged from her bedchamber, pulling a heavy wool robe over her nightgown, and opened the door to find Tommy Henderson, a 12-year-old boy whose family operated a small ranch about 5 miles south of Cedar Ridge. "Doc Mitchell," Tommy gasped, his young face pale with fear and exhaustion. "You got to come quick. There's a man hurt real bad at our place, and Pa says he might not make it through the night." Sarah began gathering her medical supplies, a routine she could perform even while half asleep. "What kind of injuries, Tommy? Accident or violence?" "Both, I think. He's got bullet holes and cuts, and he's burning up with fever. Ma's been trying to keep him alive, but she says he needs a real doctor." The Henderson Ranch was located in an area that had seen increased Comanche activity in recent weeks. Sarah knew that traveling there would involve crossing territory where war parties had been spotted by cavalry patrols, but her medical oath left no room for selective treatment based on personal safety concerns. "Tell your father I'll be there." "Within the hour," she informed Tommy, who immediately mounted his horse and raced back toward his family's property. Sarah completed her preparations methodically, packing surgical instruments, medications, and bandaging materials into her leather medical bag. She also loaded her Springfield rifle and checked her supply of ammunition, a precaution that had become standard procedure for any journey beyond the immediate vicinity of Cedar Ridge. The ride to the Henderson Ranch took her through rolling, a prairie country dotted with mesquite groves and limestone outcroppings that provided excellent concealment for anyone wishing to observe travelers without being detected. Sarah had made this journey dozens of times over the past 3 years, treating various members of the Henderson family for illnesses and injuries ranging from childhood ailments to ranch accidents. The Henderson homestead consisted of a modest log cabin, a barn constructed from local timber, and a collection of outbuildings that supported their cattle operation. The family had arrived in Texas shortly after the Civil War, seeking economic opportunities that were scarce in their native Tennessee. Robert Henderson was a hard-working man who had served honorably in the Confederate Army, while his wife, Margaret, possessed the practical skills and unwavering determination that frontier life demanded. Sarah found the Henderson family in a state of barely controlled crisis. Margaret met her at the cabin door, her normally composed demeanor cracked with worry and exhaustion. "Thank God you're here, Doctor. I've done everything I could think of, but he's getting worse." The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid, blood, and the herbal poultices that Margaret had been applying to the wounded man's injuries. What Sarah saw when she approached the makeshift sickbed stopped her cold and changed everything she thought she understood about the delicate balance of power on the Texas frontier. The patient was a Comanche warrior, perhaps 30 years old, with the distinctive braided hair and ceremonial scars that marked him as a member of the tribe's warrior elite. His powerful frame spoke of a life spent in the saddle, hunting buffalo, and engaging in the kind of mounted combat that had made the Comanche the most feared fighting force on the Great Plains. But more than his physical appearance, it was the items scattered around the bed that revealed his true identity. A war lance decorated with eagle feathers and ceremonial beadwork leaned against the cabin wall. A leather shirt adorned with intricate quill work lay folded on a nearby chair. Most significantly, a magnificent war bonnet featuring dozens of eagle feathers arranged in precise patterns rested on a wooden chest, indicating that this was no ordinary warrior. "Robert," Sarah said quietly, "do you understand who this man is?" Henderson nodded grimly. "Found him yesterday morning about a mile from here, more dead than alive. From the looks of his gear and those scars on his chest, I'd say he's a war chief, maybe even one of the big ones." The implications of the situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. If this man was indeed a high-ranking Comanche leader, his presence at the Henderson Ranch could be interpreted as either an opportunity for peace or a prelude to war. The decision about whether to treat him would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of every person living in the borderlands. "Have you reported this to Colonel Harrison?" Sarah asked, beginning her examination of the warriors' wounds, while her mind raced through the possible consequences of each choice available to them. "Not yet," Henderson admitted. "Figured I'd wait to see if he was going to live through the night. Didn't want to bring the cavalry out here if there wasn't going to be anything for them to find." Sarah's trained eye quickly catalogued the extent of the warrior's injuries. 2 bullet wounds, one in the shoulder and another that had grazed his ribs, both showing signs of infection. Multiple knife cuts across his arms and chest, suggesting he had fought hand-to-hand combat before escaping his attackers. Most seriously, a head injury that had left him unconscious and burning with fever. The wounds told a story of betrayal and violence that extended beyond simple battlefield casualties. Someone had ambushed this warrior and left him for dead. But the nature of his injuries suggested he had trusted his attackers enough to let them get close before the violence began. As Sarah began cleaning and treating the wounds, The warrior's eyes opened briefly, revealing an intelligence and awareness that surprised her. For a moment their gazes met, and she saw something that transcended the cultural barriers between them, the universal human recognition of someone fighting to survive against impossible odds. The warrior spoke a single word in Comanche before, losing consciousness again, but Margaret Henderson understood enough of the language to translate. He said, "Friend," she told Sarah, "but I don't know if he was talking about you or about whoever did this to him." The next several hours passed, in intense medical work, as Sarah fought to stabilize the warrior's condition and prevent the infections that threatened his life. She cleaned his wounds with carbolic acid, sutured the more serious cuts, and extracted bullet fragments using surgical techniques that would have been advanced even in a Boston hospital. But as dawn approached and the warrior's fever began to break, Sarah realized that the medical challenges were only the beginning of a situation that would test everything she believed about justice, mercy, and the price of doing what was right in a world where right and wrong were often separated by nothing more than the color of one's skin and the culture of one's birth. Outside the Henderson cabin, the Texas sun was rising on what would prove to be the most important 7 days in the history of the borderlands. 7 days that would determine whether Dr. Sarah Mitchell's decision to save a life would become the foundation for peace, or the spark that ignited a war that would consume everyone she had sworn to protect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By mid-morning, the Comanche warrior's condition had stabilized enough for Sarah to conduct a more thorough examination. What she discovered challenged everything she thought she knew about the man lying unconscious in the Henderson cabin. Hidden beneath his traditional war shirt, carved into his chest with deliberate precision, were scars that told a story far more complex than simple tribal warfare. The markings were not random battle wounds, but carefully crafted symbols that Sarah recognized from her medical training in Boston. During her final year at the New England Female Medical College, she had attended lectures by Dr. Ezra Whitman, a former Army surgeon who had spent 2 decades treating patients across the American frontier. Dr. Whitman had shown detailed drawings of various tribal marking systems, explaining how different Native American cultures used scarification to record significant life events, spiritual experiences, and social status. But these scars were different. Mixed among the traditional Comanche symbols were markings that belonged to an entirely different culture, Cherokee syllabary characters that represented specific words in that tribe's written language. Sarah had learned to recognize Cherokee, writing during her conversations with Martha Clearwater, the elderly Cherokee woman who had taught her about medicinal plants. "Margaret," Sarah called quietly to Mrs. Henderson, who was preparing breakfast in the cabin's kitchen area, "has this man said anything else since you found him?" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and approached the sickbed with the cautious steps of someone who understood that their situation balanced on a knife's edge. "He's been talking in his sleep, but not in Comanche. Sounded more like English, but broken up, like he was remembering pieces of conversations." Sarah continued her examination, noting details that painted an increasingly puzzling picture. The warrior's hands showed calluses consistent with handling traditional weapons, but also bore the distinctive marks of someone who had spent considerable time writing with pen and ink. His teeth were in remarkably good condition, suggesting access to better nutrition than most frontier inhabitants enjoyed. Most intriguingly, hidden among his personal effects was a small leather pouch containing items that had no place in traditional Comanche culture. Inside the pouch, Sarah found a tarnished brass button from a Union Army uniform, a small silver cross on a delicate chain, and most remarkably, a folded piece of paper containing what appeared to be a letter written in elegant English script. The letter was too damaged by blood and weather to read completely, but Sarah could make out fragments that suggested formal education and familiarity with American legal terminology. "Robert," Sarah said to Henderson, who was cleaning his rifle near the cabin's front window while keeping watch for unwanted visitors. "When you found this man, was he alone?" Henderson set down his weapon and joined them beside the sickbed. "That's the strange part, Doc. Found him maybe a quarter-mile from a cavalry patrol route, but there wasn't any sign of other Indians or soldiers in the area. No horse tracks except his own, and his mount was standing guard over him like a trained cavalry." "A horse?" The mystery deepened as Sarah examined the warrior's clothing and equipment more carefully. His moccasins were traditional Comanche craftsmanship, but the leather showed wear patterns, suggesting he spent considerable time in riding boots. His war lance was authentic tribal work, but the steel point was forged using techniques that required access to an advanced blacksmith shop. Most telling of all, his magnificent war bonnet contained eagle feathers that had been arranged according to Comanche tradition, but also incorporated beadwork patterns that belonged to tribes from entirely different regions. As if summoned by her growing questions, the warrior's eyes opened and focused on Sarah with an alertness that surprised her. When he spoke, his voice was weak but clear, and his words were in perfect English with only the slightest accent. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, quietly, "I need to speak with you about why someone tried to kill me yesterday." The Henderson family froze in stunned silence. The idea that this Comanche war chief not only spoke fluent English but knew Sarah's name suggested connections and complications that extended far beyond their remote ranch. "How do you know who I am?" Sarah asked, settling into a chair beside the bed while keeping her expression carefully neutral. The warrior attempted to sit up, then thought better of it as pain flashed across his features. "Your reputation as a healer extends into places you might not expect, Doctor. My name is Joseph Crow Feather, though I have also been known by other names in other places." Margaret Henderson gasped audibly. "Joseph Crow Feather? The one they call the Ghost Chief, the one who's been raiding settlements all along the Brazos River?" Joseph's expression grew grim. "The man who has been raiding settlements along the Brazos River is named Marcus Redwolf, and he is the reason I am lying here with bullet wounds instead of attending a peace council that was supposed to take place." 2 days ago, Sarah felt the pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align in her mind. "You're saying you're not the raider who's been attacking settlements. I'm saying that someone has been using my name and reputation to conduct raids that I not only didn't authorize, but that I've been actively trying to prevent." Joseph's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a battle on multiple fronts. "For the past 6 months, I've been working with Colonel Harrison and territorial authorities to negotiate a comprehensive peace treaty that would end the violence along the frontier." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. If Joseph Crowfeather was telling the truth, then the recent escalation in Comanche raids wasn't the result of tribal policy, but the work of a rogue war leader operating without authorization. More importantly, if peace negotiations had been progressing, then his attempted murder represented an effort to sabotage those negotiations. "Who else knew about these peace talks?" Sarah asked, her medical training helping her approach the situation with analytical precision. Too many people, unfortunately. The negotiations involved representatives from Washington, territorial authorities, cavalry leadership, and several prominent local citizens who would be affected by any treaty arrangements. Joseph winced as he adjusted his position. The problem with peace processes is that they require trust, and trust creates opportunities for betrayal. Robert Henderson had been listening with growing amazement. Are you telling us that you're not here to scout our defenses or plan attacks? I'm telling you that I was on my way to a secret meeting with Colonel Harrison when I was ambushed by men who knew exactly where I would be and when I would be there. Joseph's dark eyes carried a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. Someone in the peace process wanted to ensure that the negotiations never concluded successfully. Sarah began to understand the full scope of the situation they were facing. If Joseph Crow Feather was indeed a legitimate peace negotiator who had been betrayed by someone within the American side of the process, then saving his life could be the key to ending years of bloodshed. But if he was lying, if this was an elaborate deception designed to gain access to intelligence about settlement defenses, then helping him could result in massacre and devastation. "You'll forgive me if I find this difficult to believe," Sarah said carefully. "A Comanche war chief working for peace while his warriors continue raiding settlements seems contradictory." Joseph smiled despite his pain. "Dr. Mitchell, I suspect your own life story involves contradictions that might seem impossible to people who only know part of the truth." The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Sarah realized that her own journey from Boston socialite to frontier doctor would seem equally implausible to anyone who knew only one version of her story. "Tell me about Marcus Redwolf," she said, choosing to pursue information rather than debate credibility. "Redwolf is my cousin, the son of my father's brother. He's also one of the most skilled warriors I've ever known, and one of the most dangerous." Joseph's expression grew troubled. 2 years ago, his wife and daughter were killed during a cavalry raid on a peaceful village. Since then, he's believed that the only solution to white expansion is total warfare. Margaret Henderson had been listening intently while continuing to prepare breakfast. "So you've got 2 different Comanche leaders with completely different ideas about how to handle the situation?" "It's more complicated than that," Joseph explained. "Red Wolf has been conducting raids using my name and my war honors, making it appear that I'm leading the violence while I've been trying to negotiate peace. Every time progress is made in the talks, another raid happens that makes the Americans less willing to trust Comanche promises." The strategic brilliance of the deception was becoming clear to Sarah. By impersonating Joseph Crow Feather, Marcus Redwolf could continue his war while undermining any peace efforts led by the real Joseph. The confusion created by the identity theft would make it impossible for American authorities to distinguish between legitimate peace overtures and tactical deception. "But who benefits from preventing peace?" Robert Henderson asked. "Seems like everyone would be better off if the fighting stopped." Joseph and Sarah exchanged a look that suggested they both understood the answer to that question. Peace would indeed benefit most people on both sides of the conflict, but it would also eliminate the economic opportunities that some individuals had built around the ongoing violence. "There are people on both sides who profit from warfare," Sarah said quietly. "Arms dealers, suppliers who sell to military garrisons, land speculators who acquire property at reduced prices due to Indian threats, and politicians who build their careers on promises to protect settlers from savage attacks." "Exactly," Joseph confirmed. "Peace would mean the end of military contracts, reduced federal spending on frontier garrisons, and the loss of justification for seizing Comanche lands under the pretense of military necessity." As the morning progressed and Joseph's strength returned, he provided details about the peace negotiations that revealed both the promise and the fragility of the diplomatic process. The proposed treaty would have established clear boundaries between Comanche territory and American settlements, created mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence, and provided economic incentives for both sides to maintain peaceful relations. But the negotiations had been conducted in secret precisely because of the opposition they would face from various interest groups. Military contractors would lose lucrative supply contracts if frontier garrisons were reduced. Land speculators would be unable to acquire territory if Comanche claims were legally recognized. Political careers built on anti-Indian sentiment would collapse if peace actually proved achievable. The ambush wasn't random, Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger as the fever medication Sarah had administered began to take effect. Someone knew the exact route I would take to reach the meeting site. They knew when I would be traveling alone, without my usual warriors for protection. Most importantly, they knew enough about the peace process to understand that killing me would ensure its failure. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Joseph was telling the truth, then his attempted murder represented a conspiracy that extended into the highest levels of territorial government and military command. Someone with access to classified information about the peace negotiations had provided that intelligence to Marcus Redwolf or his allies. "How many people knew about your travel plans?" she asked. Colonel Harrison, his aide Lieutenant Morrison, Territorial Governor Williams, and 3 members of the Territorial Council who were participating in the negotiations. Joseph's expression grew dark. One of those men decided that peace was less valuable than whatever benefits they derived from continued warfare. The implications were staggering. If one of the most senior American officials in the region had conspired to sabotage peace negotiations, then Joseph's survival represented a threat to powerful interests that would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As if to underscore the danger of their situation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them through the cabin's walls. Robert Henderson immediately moved to the window, his rifle ready for action. 6 riders coming from the direction of Cedar Ridge, he reported grimly. Moving fast, like they're looking for something specific. Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized the implications. Someone had discovered that Joseph Crow Feather was alive and had tracked him to the Henderson Ranch. The question was whether the approaching riders represented rescue or elimination, and the answer would determine whether the next few minutes brought salvation or catastrophe. Joseph struggled to sit up despite his injuries, his warrior instincts overriding his physical limitations. "Dr. Mitchell," he said urgently, "if those riders are who I think they are, then the 7 days I mentioned aren't about my people coming to negotiate. They're about giving the conspirators time to finish what they started yesterday." The hoofbeats grew louder, and Sarah realized that her decision to save a wounded man's life had drawn her into a conspiracy that could determine the fate of everyone living on the Texas frontier. The approaching riders would force her to choose between her medical oath and her personal safety, between the promise of peace and the certainty of violence. Outside, voices called out in the crisp morning air, and Sarah recognized one of them as belonging to someone she had trusted completely until this very moment. Lieutenant Daniel Morrison dismounted from his cavalry horse with the practiced efficiency of a career soldier, but Sarah noticed something in his movements that she had never observed before, the careful alertness of a man expecting trouble rather than the confident stride of someone arriving to help. Morrison had been Colonel Harrison's most trusted aide for 2 years, and Sarah had treated him multiple times for minor injuries sustained during patrol duties. She had always found him to be professional, courteous, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of frontier settlers. But as Morrison approached the Henderson cabin with 5 other soldiers, Sarah saw something in his pale blue eyes that made her blood run cold. This wasn't the expression of a concerned military officer responding to reports of trouble. This was the focused intensity of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson," Morrison called out in his familiar Virginia accent, "we received word that you might have encountered some trouble out here. Colonel Harrison sent us to ensure your safety." Robert Henderson opened the cabin door. but remained positioned so that he could quickly retreat inside if necessary. "What kind of word would that be, Lieutenant?" "Reports of Comanche activity in this area. Scouts claimed they saw a warrior heading in this direction yesterday." Morrison's gaze swept across the visible portions of the cabin interior with professional thoroughness. "We're conducting a systematic search to ensure no hostile forces are hiding in the vicinity." Sarah felt Joseph tense beside her on the sickbed, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the knife that lay among his personal effects. She placed her own hand on his wrist, a gentle but firm reminder that violence would only confirm Morrison's suspicions and doom them all. "We haven't seen any Comanche warriors," Margaret Henderson said, with the steady composure that had made her a successful frontier wife. "Dr. Mitchell is here treating a patient, but I'm sure she can tell you more about that." Morrison's attention focused on Sarah with laser-like intensity. "Dr. Mitchell, I wasn't aware you had been called out to the Henderson place. What kind of medical situation requires your attention?" The question contained layers of suspicion that confirmed Sarah's growing fears about Morrison's true purpose. A legitimate military inquiry would have focused on security concerns rather than the details of her medical practice. Morrison was fishing for information, trying to determine what she knew and how much of a threat she represented to whatever conspiracy had nearly cost Joseph his life. "A ranch accident," Sarah replied smoothly, drawing on her years of experience, dealing with suspicious authorities who questioned her medical decisions. "Mr. Henderson injured himself while working with livestock, nothing that requires military attention." Morrison stepped closer to the cabin door, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "I'm afraid I'll need to verify that personally, Doctor. Recent intelligence suggests that Comanche raiders have been using medical emergencies as pretext to gain access to isolated homesteads. The accusation was both clever and dangerous. By suggesting that Indians might impersonate patients to infiltrate white settlements, Morrison had created justification for examining Joseph while simultaneously casting doubt on Sarah's professional judgment. If she refused to allow the inspection, she would appear to be concealing something. If she agreed, Joseph's identity would be revealed and his assassination completed. But Sarah had spent 3 years navigating the complex politics of frontier life, and she understood that survival often depended on misdirection rather than direct confrontation. "Of course, Lieutenant, patient confidentiality doesn't extend to matters of military security." She moved toward the cabin's rear room, ostensibly to prepare her patient for examination, but actually to buy precious time while her mind raced through possible escape strategies. Joseph's condition had improved enough for him to walk short distances, but he was still too weak for extended travel or physical combat. "Joseph," she whispered urgently as she helped him sit up, "can you pass for an injured ranch hand, even briefly?" His dark eyes flashed with understanding. Despite his weakened state, Joseph Crowfeather's intelligence remained sharp, and he immediately grasped both the danger they faced and the strategy Sarah was proposing. "How much acting will be required?" he asked quietly, reaching for his shirt. "Enough to convince Morrison that you're a Mexican vaquero who was injured in a riding accident. Your English is good enough, and your complexion is dark enough to make it believable." Joseph nodded, then paused as a troubling thought occurred to him. "Dr. Mitchell, if Morrison is the man who betrayed the peace negotiations, then he'll recognize me the moment he sees my face clearly." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the fatal flaw in her improvised plan. Morrison hadn't just provided intelligence to Joseph's enemies. He had been directly involved in the peace negotiations and would have met Joseph face to face during preliminary discussions. "Then we need a different approach," she said, her mind shifting to more desperate alternatives. The sound of heavy boots on the cabin's wooden porch indicated that Morrison was growing impatient with the delay. "Dr. Mitchell, is there some problem with your patient?" "Just ensuring he's properly dressed for company," Sarah called back, while frantically searching the room for anything that might help disguise Joseph's identity or create an opportunity for escape. Her gaze fell on the medical supplies she had brought from Cedar Ridge, and a desperate plan began to form. Among her pharmaceutical preparations was a bottle of laudanum, a powerful opium-based painkiller that was commonly used for serious injuries. If administered in the right dosage, laudanum could render a patient semi-conscious and incoherent, making detailed identification difficult. "Joseph, I need you to trust me completely," she whispered, reaching for the laudanum bottle. "This will make you appear severely injured and barely conscious. Can you maintain that deception even if Morrison tries to question you directly?" Joseph studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "My life is already in your hands, Doctor. I follow your lead." Sarah quickly prepared a syringe with a carefully measured dose of laudanum, enough to create the desired effect without endangering Joseph's recovery. As she administered the injection, she heard Morrison's voice growing more insistent outside. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to need you to step aside so my men can conduct a proper search of the premises." "Lieutenant Morrison," Robert Henderson's voice carried a dangerous edge, "this is my property, and I don't recall inviting your men to search anything." Sarah recognized the sound of a confrontation that could quickly escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Henderson was a Confederate veteran who had little love for federal authority under the best of circumstances, and Morrison's increasingly aggressive behavior was triggering the kind of territorial response that could lead to violence. Within minutes, the laudanum began to take effect, and Joseph's alertness faded into the slack-featured stupor of someone heavily medicated for severe pain. Sarah quickly mussed his hair, smeared dirt on his face from a flower pot near the window, and arranged his position to suggest someone who had been badly injured and was barely clinging to consciousness. "All right, Lieutenant," Sarah called out. "My patient is ready for your inspection." Morrison entered the cabin's rear room with 3 of his soldiers, their weapons drawn but not yet pointed at anyone. Sarah noted the professional way they positioned themselves to cover all potential escape routes, while maintaining the pretense that this was a routine security check. Morrison's gaze swept across Joseph's seemingly unconscious form, and Sarah watched carefully for any sign of recognition. For several tense seconds, the lieutenant studied the injured man's features, but the combination of medical sedation, accumulated grime, and strategic positioning made positive identification difficult. "What exactly happened to him?" Morrison asked, stepping closer to the bed. "Thrown from his horse while chasing strays," Sarah replied, falling into the familiar rhythm of providing medical information to military authorities. "Possible concussion, several broken ribs, and severe bruising. I've given him laudanum for the pain, which is why he's not very responsive." Morrison leaned over Joseph's apparently unconscious form, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized that despite the disguise, Morrison was beginning to have suspicions. "He looks familiar," Morrison muttered, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "Something about the bone structure." Before Sarah could respond, Joseph's eyes fluttered open, and he spoke in a slurred, heavily accented voice that perfectly mimicked a Mexican vaquero under the influence of powerful painkillers. "Agua, por favor," he mumbled, his head lolling to one side with convincing helplessness. "Duele mucho." The performance was masterful. Even Sarah, who knew it was an act, found herself believing that she was looking at a badly injured ranch hand rather than a Comanche war chief. Joseph had somehow managed to alter not just his accent, but his entire physical presence, transforming himself into exactly the kind of injured worker that Morrison would expect to find on a remote cattle ranch. Morrison stepped back from the bed, apparently satisfied that his suspicions had been unfounded. "Mexican," he said dismissively. "Probably an illegal anyway. These people have no business being in American territory." The casual bigotry in Morrison's voice revealed another piece of the puzzle surrounding his involvement in the conspiracy against the peace negotiations. Men who viewed other cultures as inherently inferior would naturally oppose treaties that recognized the rights and legitimacy of Native American governments. "He's a skilled horseman who works for Mr. Henderson," Sarah said firmly. "His immigration status is none of my concern as a medical professional." Morrison's expression hardened. "Your concerns should extend to the security implications of treating individuals whose loyalties may not align with American interests, Doctor." The threatening undertone in Morrison's words made it clear that Sarah's reputation for treating patients regardless of their background had not gone unnoticed by territorial authorities. She was being warned that her medical practice was under scrutiny, and that future decisions to help the wrong people could have serious consequences. "My medical oath requires me to treat anyone who needs help," Sarah replied steadily. "I'm sure Colonel Harrison would support that position." At the mention of Harrison's name, Morrison's demeanor shifted subtly, and Sarah caught a fleeting expression that suggested the lieutenant's relationship with his commanding officer might be more complicated than it appeared. "Colonel Harrison has many responsibilities and doesn't always have complete information about the situations his subordinates encounter," Morrison said carefully. "Sometimes decisions must be made based on immediate tactical considerations rather than abstract medical principles." The statement was both a threat and a revelation. Morrison was suggesting that he sometimes acted independently of Harrison's direct orders, making decisions based on his own interpretation of military necessity. If Morrison had indeed betrayed the peace negotiations, he had done so without his commander's knowledge or approval. As Morrison prepared to leave with his soldiers, he delivered a final warning that chilled Sarah to the bone. "Dr. Mitchell, I trust you'll report any unusual activity in this area directly to me. Recent intelligence suggests that hostile forces may be planning significant operations in the coming days." After the soldiers departed, Sarah waited nearly an hour before administering an antidote that would counteract the laudanum's effects and restore Joseph to full consciousness. During that time, she processed the implications of Morrison's visit and the disturbing picture it painted of the conspiracy they were facing. Morrison's behavior confirmed that he was indeed the source of the intelligence that had led to Joseph's ambush. More troubling, his reference to upcoming operations suggested that the assassination attempt was only the beginning of a larger plan designed to escalate violence along the frontier. When Joseph finally emerged from his medication-induced stupor, his first words addressed the heart of their dilemma. "Dr. Mitchell, we now know who betrayed the peace negotiations, but we still don't know how many others are involved or what they're planning next." Sarah nodded grimly. Morrison mentioned recent intelligence about hostile operations. "If he's helping Marcus Red Wolf plan more raids using your identity, then every day we delay gives them more opportunities to undermine any hope of peace." The situation had evolved from a simple medical emergency into a race against time to prevent, a conspiracy that could plunge the entire frontier region into prolonged warfare. Sarah realized that saving Joseph's life had been only the first step in a much larger battle for the future of relations between American settlers and the Comanche Nation. Outside the Henderson cabin, the Texas sun climbed toward its zenith, marking the passage of another day in the 7 that would determine whether peace or war would define the coming years. But now they knew the face of their enemy, and that knowledge gave them both hope and a clear target for the fight that lay ahead. 3 hours after Morrison's departure, Joseph had recovered enough strength to reveal information that transformed Sarah's understanding of the stakes they faced. As evening shadows lengthened across the Henderson ranch, he produced a hidden leather pouch from inside his war shirt, one that Morrison's search had failed to discover. The contents would prove that the conspiracy against peace extended far beyond one ambitious lieutenant. "Dr. Mitchell," Joseph said, carefully extracting a collection of documents from the waterproof pouch. "What I'm about to show you will explain why someone was willing to risk everything to prevent me from reaching Colonel Harrison." The first document was a detailed map of the Texas frontier, marked with red ink to indicate planned attack sites along a 100-mile stretch of settlements. But these weren't random raid targets. They were strategically chosen locations that would maximize casualties while creating the appearance of a coordinated Comanche offensive designed to drive Americans from the region entirely. Sarah studied the map with growing horror. These attacks would kill hundreds of people, and they're scheduled to begin tomorrow night, Joseph confirmed grimly. Marcus Redwolf has been gathering warriors from multiple bands, telling them that I've ordered a final war to drive all whites from Comanche territory. The men following him believe they're carrying out my direct commands. The second document was even more damaging. A series of correspondence between Morrison and civilian contractors who supplied the cavalry garrisons. The letters detailed a scheme to inflate military supply costs during periods of increased conflict, splitting the profits between Morrison and his civilian conspirators. Morrison isn't just betraying peace negotiations for ideological reasons, Sarah realized, reading through the financial records. He's profiting from the warfare. The peace treaty would have reduced military presence in the region by 70%, Joseph explained. Morrison and his associates would lose contracts worth thousands of dollars annually. They need the fighting to continue indefinitely. But the most shocking document was a letter bearing the seal of the territorial governor's office, written in Governor Williams' own hand. It authorized Morrison to take whatever measures prove necessary to ensure continued military vigilance against the Indian threat, and promised that questions regarding specific tactical decisions will not be pursued if the overall strategic objectives are achieved. Margaret Henderson, who had been listening from across the room while preparing supper, dropped the plate she was holding. "The territorial governor is part of this conspiracy. Williams may not know the specific details of Morrison's methods," Joseph said carefully, "but he's given written authorization for actions that could include sabotaging peace negotiations. That letter would protect Morrison from legal consequences even if his involvement became known." Sarah felt the weight of institutional corruption settling over her like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just a rogue military officer pursuing personal profit. It was a coordinated effort involving multiple levels of territorial government to prevent peace through deception, violence, and political manipulation. "There's something else," Joseph continued, producing the final document from his pouch. "Morrison isn't working alone within the military. He has at least 3 other cavalry officers involved in the conspiracy, including Major Franklin Garrett, who commands the garrison at Fort Richardson." The implications were staggering. Fort Richardson was the largest military installation in the region, with over 400 soldiers under Garrett's command. If the fort's commanding officer was involved in the conspiracy, then the plotters had access to significant military resources that could be used to escalate conflict rather than prevent it. "How did you obtain these documents?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would be disturbing. Joseph's expression grew dark with painful memories. 3 weeks ago, one of Morrison's co-conspirators, Captain Samuel Crawford, contacted me through intermediaries. He claimed to have evidence of corruption within the military supply system and wanted to provide that information to support the peace negotiations. "It was a trap," Robert Henderson observed, recognizing the classic elements of military deception. Crawford arranged a secret meeting in the Badlands north of Fort Richardson. When I arrived, I found him dying from knife wounds. He'd been tortured for information about what he knew and who he'd told. With his last breath, he gave me these documents and warned me that Morrison was planning to eliminate everyone who could expose the conspiracy. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Crawford was never actually working with you. He was Morrison's partner who developed a conscience or got greedy and demanded a larger share of the profits. Either way, Morrison decided he was a liability and had him killed. But Crawford managed to steal these documents before his death, intending to use them as insurance against his partners. Instead, they became evidence of the conspiracy's scope. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing. Morrison and his associates weren't just preventing peace. They were orchestrating a war that would justify massive military expansion, increased federal spending on frontier defense, and the elimination of Comanche territorial claims through systematic extermination. As if summoned by their discussion of immediate dangers, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the evening air. But this time, the riders weren't coming from the direction of Cedar Ridge. They were approaching from the south, from the direction of Comanche territory. Joseph struggled to his feet despite Sarah's protests, moving to the cabin's front window. With the practiced stealth of a warrior whose survival had always depended on quick assessment of potential threats. What he saw made him curse softly in Comanche before turning back to the others with grim determination. 7 riders, moving fast but not trying to conceal their approach. They're flying a white flag, which means they're here for negotiation rather than combat. "Your people?" Margaret Henderson asked, reaching for the rifle her husband kept near. "The kitchen door. Some of them," Joseph confirmed. "I can see my brother Walking Bear and 2 of my most trusted war leaders. But there are also men I don't recognize, which suggests this delegation represents multiple bands, rather than just my own warriors." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized they were about to face the next phase of the crisis that had begun with Joseph's arrival. His own people had come looking for him, and their presence would either provide the support needed to expose Morrison's conspiracy or complicate an already dangerous situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. The riders drew to a halt. Outside the cabin, their horses breathing hard from extended travel, Walking Bear, a man who shared Joseph's intelligent eyes but possessed an additional quality of barely contained violence, dismounted and approached the cabin door with the careful dignity of someone conducting formal diplomatic business. "Joseph Crow Feather," Walking Bear called out in English, clearly aware that the cabin contained white occupants who needed to understand the nature of this visit. "We have come to learn why you failed to attend the War Council 3 days ago." Joseph opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, despite his obvious physical weakness. Sarah watched through the window as the 2 brothers confronted each other with the complex mixture of affection and political tension that characterized relationships between Comanche leaders who disagreed about fundamental strategy. "I failed to attend because someone tried to kill me before I could reach the meeting site," Joseph replied, his voice carrying across the evening air with unmistakable authority despite his injuries. Walking Bear's expression shifted from concern to cold fury. Who would dare attack a war chief, traveling under traditional protection? "White soldiers, acting on orders from men who profit from our conflict with the Americans," Joseph answered. "Men who fear peace more than they fear war." The conversation continued in Comanche for several minutes, with Joseph apparently providing details about Morrison's conspiracy and the evidence he had discovered. Sarah could understand enough of the language to follow the general flow of discussion, and what she heard increased her anxiety about the immediate future. Walking Bear was arguing for immediate retaliation against American settlements, insisting that Joseph's assassination attempt proved that peace negotiations were pointless. Joseph was countering that revenge attacks would play directly into the conspirators' hands by providing justification for military escalation. But it was the third voice in the conversation that worried Sarah most. One of the unidentified war leaders was advocating for something that Joseph was rejecting with increasing vehemence. Sarah couldn't understand the specific words, but the tone suggested disagreement about tactics that could have devastating consequences for everyone in the region. When Joseph finally returned to the cabin, his expression was grim with the weight of impossible choices. "Dr. Mitchell, the situation has become more complicated. My brother and his allies have been told that I've been captured and tortured by American soldiers. They're here to either rescue me or confirm my death so they can justify the war, Marcus. Red Wolf has been advocating. What happens when they learn you're alive and recovering?" Sarah asked. "That depends on whether they believe my explanation about Morrison's conspiracy or whether they think I've been compromised by extended contact with whites." Joseph sank into a chair, exhaustion and frustration evident in every line of his body. "Some of my people have never trusted the peace negotiations. They believe any Comanche leader who works with Americans must have been corrupted or coerced." Robert Henderson joined their conversation, his weathered face reflecting the practical concerns of a man whose family's survival depended on making the right choices in impossible situations. "What do they want from us?" "They want proof that I haven't been turned against my own people," Joseph replied, "and they want assurance that helping me won't result in military retaliation against their families." Sarah realized that the next few hours would determine not just Joseph's fate, but the future of everyone living along the Texas frontier. If Walking Bear and his delegation could be convinced that Morrison's conspiracy was real, and that peace remained possible, they might become allies in exposing the plot. But if they concluded that Joseph had been compromised or that the whites couldn't be trusted under any circumstances, they would likely join Marcus Red Wolf's war faction and help launch the devastating attacks that were already being planned. "What kind of proof would convince them?" Sarah asked. Joseph smiled grimly. "The kind that would require us to do something very dangerous and probably impossible." As darkness settled over the Henderson ranch, Sarah prepared to learn just how far she would be willing to go to prevent a war that would consume everything she had worked to build in her new life on the Texas frontier. The 7 days that had begun with a simple medical emergency were rapidly becoming a countdown to either peace or catastrophe, and the choice between them would soon be entirely in her hands. The proof Walking Bear demanded would require Sarah to do something that violated every principle of medical ethics she had ever learned. She would have to help Joseph fake his own death, convincingly enough to fool both his own people and Morrison's conspiracy, while keeping him alive long enough to expose the plot that threatened to destroy the frontier. "The plan is insane," Sarah said for the third time, as Joseph outlined the details of what he was proposing. "Even if we could make it believable, the risks are enormous." Joseph sat across from her at the Hendersons' kitchen table, maps and documents, spread between them like the pieces of an incredibly dangerous puzzle. His strength had returned enough for coherent planning, but Sarah could see the pain and exhaustion that still marked his features. "Dr. Mitchell, consider the alternatives," Joseph replied patiently. "If Walking Bear returns to our people believing that I've been compromised by extended contact with whites, he'll throw his support behind Marcus Red Wolf's war faction. The attack scheduled for tomorrow night will proceed as planned. But if we fake your death, won't that have the same result?" Margaret Henderson asked from her position near the stove, where she was preparing what might be their last peaceful meal for weeks. "Not if we do it correctly," Joseph explained. "Walking Bear knows that I've been working toward peace, despite opposition from within our own councils. If he believes that American treachery killed me while I was trying to negotiate, he'll be angry enough to consider exposing the conspiracy rather than simply pursuing revenge. Sarah studied the medical supplies she had brought from Cedar Ridge, calculating dosages and timing with the precision that had made her reputation as a frontier doctor. I have enough belladonna extract to simulate death symptoms for approximately 6 hours. Slowed pulse, reduced respiration, unconsciousness that would appear identical to clinical death to anyone without advanced medical training. 6 hours should be sufficient, Joseph confirmed. Walking Bear will want to take my body back to our territory for proper burial ceremonies. During the journey, I'll revive and provide him with the evidence about Morrison's conspiracy. Robert Henderson had been listening to their planning with the skeptical attention of a man who had survived 3 years on the frontier by anticipating everything that could go wrong. What happens if the dosage is incorrect? Too little, and the deception fails. Too much, and it becomes real death instead of fake death. The question struck at the heart of Sarah's medical anxiety. Belladonna was a powerful alkaloid that could indeed simulate death symptoms, but the margin between effective dosage and lethal overdose was dangerously narrow. She had used the substance before to treat certain conditions, but never in the massive doses that would be required to maintain the deception for hours. I'll need to monitor his vital signs continuously until the antidote takes effect, Sarah said, her mind already working through the technical challenges. That means I'll have to accompany Walking Bear's party when they take Joseph's apparent body back to Comanche territory. The implications of that decision settled over the room like a thunderclap. Sarah would be placing herself completely at the mercy of Comanche warriors who had no reason to trust her and every reason to view her as a potential enemy. If the deception failed, if Joseph died from the medication, or if Walking Bear decided that she was part of the conspiracy against his people, she would likely face torture and death far from any hope of rescue. Dr. Mitchell, Joseph said quietly, what you're proposing would require courage beyond anything I have the right to ask of anyone. You're not asking, Sarah replied firmly. I'm offering. This conspiracy threatens everyone living on the frontier, white and Comanche alike. If we don't stop it, hundreds of people will die in the coming weeks. As evening deepened into night, they finalized the details of a plan that would either expose Morrison's conspiracy or get them all killed. Joseph would take the belladonna extract and fall into a death-like coma. Walking Bear would be told that Joseph had succumbed to his injuries despite Sarah's medical efforts. The war chief's apparent body would be returned to Comanche territory for burial, with Sarah accompanying the party as a prisoner taken to answer for her failure to save an important leader. During the journey, when they were far enough from American settlements to avoid immediate military intervention, Joseph would revive and reveal the truth about Morrison's plot. The evidence they carried would prove that the assassination attempt had been orchestrated by Americans who wanted to prevent peace, not by natural complications from his injuries. But first, they had to convince Walking Bear that the death was genuine, and that required a performance that would test every skill Sarah had learned during her medical training. The Comanche delegation had made camp about a quarter-mile from the Henderson cabin, close enough to respond quickly to developments, but far enough away to avoid provoking the White family unnecessarily. Sarah could see their campfire flickering through the darkness, a reminder that 7 warriors were waiting for answers that would determine the future of the entire region. Walking Bear is not a man who accepts deception easily, Joseph warned, as Sarah prepared the belladonna extract. He's been suspicious of the peace negotiations from the beginning, and he'll be looking for any sign that this is a trick designed to protect American interests. Then we make sure he finds no such signs, Sarah replied, measuring the dangerous substance with the precision of someone whose life depended on getting the dosage exactly right. At midnight, Joseph swallowed the carefully prepared medication and lay back on the Hendersons' bed to wait for the effects to take hold. Sarah monitored his pulse and respiration as the powerful alkaloid began to slow his bodily functions to levels that would mimic clinical death. "How long before it takes full effect?" Margaret Henderson asked, her voice tight with anxiety. 20 to 30 minutes for complete unconsciousness, Sarah replied, never taking her eyes off Joseph's vital signs. Another hour before his pulse and breathing slow to the point where they would be undetectable without medical instruments. As the belladonna worked its dangerous magic, Joseph's skin grew pale and cool to the touch. His breathing became so shallow that Sarah had to place a mirror under his nose to detect the faint condensation that proved he was still alive. His pulse slowed to barely 20 beats per minute, a rate that would indicate imminent death to anyone without access to proper monitoring equipment. "It's working," Sarah whispered, both relieved and terrified by the effectiveness of the deception. "From a casual examination, he appears to be dead." Robert Henderson had been assigned the grim task of informing Walking Bear about Joseph's apparent death. He left the cabin with the reluctant steps of a man about to deliver news that could spark a war, while Sarah remained beside Joseph's motionless form, monitoring his condition and preparing for the most dangerous performance of her life. Walking Bear's reaction to the news was immediate and explosive. Sarah heard shouting in Comanche, followed by the sound of horses being saddled with urgent efficiency. Within minutes, the entire delegation was riding toward the Henderson cabin with the intensity of warriors responding to a crisis. Walking Bear entered the cabin like a force of nature, his presence filling the small room with barely contained violence and grief. He was slightly taller than Joseph, with the same intelligent eyes but a harder edge that spoke of someone who had seen too much warfare and too little peace. He approached Joseph's apparently lifeless body with the careful attention of someone who understood that appearances could be deceiving. Sarah held her breath as Walking Bear placed his hand on Joseph's chest, feeling for heartbeat and breathing. The examination lasted several minutes, during which Sarah forced herself to remain calm, despite knowing that discovery would mean death for all of them. "How did he die?" Walking Bear asked in English, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of a man struggling to control his emotions. "His injuries were more severe than I initially realized," Sarah replied, falling into the familiar rhythm of providing medical explanations to grieving relatives. "Internal bleeding and infection weakened him beyond recovery. I did everything possible, but the damage was too extensive." Walking Bear studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to read truth from subtle expressions. "You are the doctor who treats anyone, regardless of their people or their politics." "I am." "Then you would have fought hard to save him, even though he was Comanche." Sarah nodded, recognizing that Walking Bear was testing her credibility by appealing to her known reputation for medical integrity. "I would have fought to save anyone with those injuries." Walking Bear turned back to Joseph's motionless form, his expression revealing the complex mixture of grief and rage that Joseph had predicted. "My brother believed that peace was possible between our peoples. He thought that men of good faith could find solutions that would benefit everyone. Perhaps they still can," Sarah said carefully, "if his death serves to expose those who were working against peace." The comment was risky, but necessary to plant the seeds of the revelation that would come during the journey to Comanche territory. Walking Bear looked at her sharply, his warrior instincts detecting something beneath the surface of her words. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either advance their dangerous plan or doom it to failure. Your brother mentioned concerns about betrayal within the American leadership. He believed that someone was sabotaging the peace negotiations for personal gain. Walking Bear's eyes narrowed with interest and suspicion. He told you this? He was delirious with fever and pain. He spoke of documents and evidence, but I couldn't understand most of what he was saying. It was a careful lie, designed to suggest that Joseph had revealed information without making Sarah appear to be actively involved in political matters beyond her medical responsibilities. Walking Bear absorbed the information while studying. Joseph's face with the painful intensity of someone saying goodbye to a beloved brother. He will be buried with the honors due to a war chief who died trying to protect his people, Walking Bear said finally. You will come with us to explain to our council how he died and what he might have learned about American treachery. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized that the first phase of their desperate plan had succeeded. Walking Bear was taking Joseph's apparent body back to Comanche territory, and he was bringing her along as a witness who might have information about the conspiracy that had led to his brother's death. But as the Comanche warriors prepared to transport Joseph's motionless form, Sarah knew that the most dangerous part of their mission was just beginning. They would be traveling deep into territory where no American had ventured peacefully in years, carrying evidence that could either prevent a war or trigger the most devastating conflict the frontier had ever seen. The success of their mission would depend on Joseph surviving the dangerous medication long enough to revive at exactly the right moment, and on Sarah's ability to convince a council of Comanche war leaders that peace was still possible despite the betrayal that had nearly cost their chief his life. As they rode into the darkness toward an uncertain fate, Sarah realized that the next 24 hours would determine whether her decision to save a wounded warrior would become the foundation for lasting peace, or the final act in a tragedy that would consume everyone she had come to care about on the unforgiving Texas frontier. The journey into Comanche territory began before dawn, with Sarah riding behind one of Walking Bear's warriors, while Joseph's apparently lifeless body was carried on a travois constructed from lodge poles and buffalo hide. The procession moved with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to traveling through dangerous country. But Sarah could feel the tension radiating from every member of the war party. They were heading into the Llano Estacado, the vast elevated plain that served as the heart of Comanche power. This was country that no American military force had ever successfully penetrated, a landscape so harsh and unforgiving that it had defeated every attempt at exploration or conquest. For Sarah, riding deeper into this wilderness meant leaving behind any hope of rescue or retreat. As the sun climbed higher, revealing the endless expanse of grassland that stretched to every horizon, Sarah began to understand why the Comanche had been able to resist American expansion for so long. This wasn't just empty land. It was a fortress created by geography itself, where water sources were hidden, where landmarks were subtle and deceptive, and where anyone unfamiliar with the terrain could wander for days without finding food, water, or shelter. Walking Bear rode at the head of their small column, his posture rigid with grief and barely contained anger. Sarah had been positioned in the middle of the group, close enough to monitor Joseph's condition discreetly, but surrounded by warriors who would kill her instantly if they suspected deception. The arrangement was both protective and threatening, acknowledging her value as a witness while ensuring she couldn't escape or cause trouble. Throughout the morning, Sarah watched Joseph's motionless form for any sign that the belladonna was wearing off prematurely. His skin remained pale and cool, his breathing so shallow that it was virtually undetectable. According to her calculations, the medication should maintain its effects for another 4 hours, but individual reactions to powerful alkaloids could vary dramatically. The warrior riding behind her, a man called Stone Wolf, spoke English well enough to serve as her guard and interrogator during the journey. His questions came in casual intervals, seemingly innocent conversations that were actually careful probes designed to extract information about American military capabilities and political intentions. "You have been on the frontier for many seasons," Stone Wolf observed as they crossed a dry creek bed lined with cottonwood trees. "You must have treated many soldiers wounded in battles with our warriors." Sarah recognized the fishing expedition for what it was, but answered honestly, since truth was less dangerous than lies that could be exposed later. "I've treated wounds from many causes: ranch accidents, construction injuries, occasional conflicts with raiders." "What do the soldiers say about fighting Comanche warriors? Do they speak of fear or confidence?" The question revealed Stone Wolf's real interest: assessing American military morale and tactical thinking. Sarah chose her words carefully, providing information that was accurate but not militarily useful. Most soldiers respect Comanche fighting skills. They know that mounted Comanche warriors are among the finest light cavalry in the world. Stone Wolf nodded approvingly at her acknowledgement of their military prowess. "Your people fight like farmers, trying to be warriors. They depend too much on numbers and not enough on skill." Sarah didn't argue the point, recognizing that military analysis wasn't her expertise and that disagreeing with her captor would serve no useful purpose. But the conversation revealed something important about Comanche strategic thinking. They viewed the conflict with Americans as winnable if conducted according to their own tactical principles. As the day progressed, the landscape began to change subtly. The rolling grassland gave way to more broken country, with arroyos and mesas that provided natural defensive positions. Sarah realized they were approaching the location where the Comanche Council would convene to hear Walking Bear's report about his brother's death, but more importantly, she began to detect signs that Joseph's condition was starting to change. His skin temperature was gradually returning to normal, and his breathing was becoming slightly more pronounced. The belladonna was wearing off ahead of schedule, which meant they would need to reach their destination and begin the revelation process before Joseph regained full consciousness unexpectedly. "Stone Wolf," Sarah said carefully, "how much farther to the council meeting place?" The warrior studied her with suspicious interest. "Why do you ask, white woman?" Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that showing medical concern for a dead patient would seem natural and wouldn't raise suspicions about her true motives. "I'm concerned about the preservation of the body in this heat. If the journey takes much longer, there could be complications that would make proper burial ceremonies difficult." Stone Wolf's expression softened slightly at what he interpreted as respectful concern for Comanche burial traditions. "We will reach the council fires before the sun touches the western horizon." That gave them perhaps 3 hours before they needed to initiate the next phase of their plan. Sarah calculated that Joseph should begin regaining consciousness within 2 hours, which would provide a narrow window for the carefully orchestrated revelation that would either save or doom them all. The council meeting place turned out to be a natural amphitheater carved by wind and water from red sandstone, with a spring-fed pool providing the water necessary to support a large gathering. As their party descended into the hidden valley, Sarah saw smoke rising from dozens of campfires, indicating that representatives from multiple Comanche bands had assembled for what promised to be a crucial war council. The sight that greeted them in the valley below made Sarah's heart race with a mixture of awe and terror. Nearly 200 Comanche warriors had gathered around the council fires, their horses grazing in herds that darkened the grassland like living shadows. These were the finest light cavalry fighters in North America, men whose military skills had held the advancing American frontier at bay for decades. But what disturbed Sarah most was the presence of Marcus Red Wolf himself, identifiable by the distinctive war paint and ceremonial regalia that marked him as a war chief of the highest rank. Red Wolf stood near the largest fire, surrounded by warriors whose body language indicated absolute loyalty and readiness for immediate combat. Walking. Bear's arrival with Joseph's apparent body created an immediate sensation throughout the gathering. Warriors abandoned their conversations and meals to crowd around the travois, their faces reflecting shock, grief, and rising anger at the news of their war chief's death. Red Wolf approached with the confident stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment to consolidate his power and launch the war he had been advocating. "Walking Bear!" he called out in English, clearly intending for Sarah to understand his words. "I grieve for our brother's death, but I am not surprised. This is what comes of trusting the Americans' promises of peace." Walking Bear's response was careful and measured, reflecting his awareness that Red Wolf was attempting to use Joseph's death as justification for immediate military action. Joseph died from wounds suffered in an ambush, but the circumstances of that ambush raise questions about who was truly responsible. "The Americans were responsible," Red Wolf declared, with the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided on his course of action. "Their soldiers attacked our war chief while he traveled under traditional protection. This treachery proves that peace negotiations are worthless." Sarah listened to the exchange while discreetly monitoring Joseph's condition. His pulse was strengthening, and she could detect subtle changes in his muscle tension that indicated the belladonna's effects were diminishing rapidly. They had perhaps 30 minutes before he began to regain consciousness, which meant the revelation would have to begin soon. But the political situation in the council was deteriorating faster than she had anticipated. Red Wolf's influence over the assembled warriors was clearly substantial, and his arguments for immediate retaliation were finding receptive audiences among men who had lost family members to American expansion. "The white woman doctor should answer for her failure to save Joseph Crow Feather," Red Wolf continued, his gaze fixing on Sarah with predatory intensity. "Perhaps she can explain why American medicine was unable to heal wounds that should not have been fatal to a warrior of his strength." The accusation was both a challenge to Sarah's medical competence and a trap designed to make her defensive about American capabilities. But more dangerously, it was an attempt to focus the council's anger on her personally, making her a scapegoat for Joseph's apparent death. Walking Bear intervened before Sarah could respond. "The doctor fought to save my brother's life. I watched her work through the night, using skills that kept him alive longer than should have been possible." "Yet he still died," Red Wolf countered. "And now we have only her word about the circumstances of his injuries and the treatment he received." Sarah realized that Red Wolf was systematically eliminating any narrative that might interfere with his plans for war. By questioning her credibility and suggesting that Joseph's death resulted from American medical incompetence rather than deliberate violence, Red Wolf was preventing the council from considering the possibility of conspiracy within American leadership. The moment had come to take the most dangerous gamble of Sarah's life. Joseph's eyes were beginning to flutter with the first signs of returning consciousness, and she could see subtle changes in his breathing that indicated full awakening was imminent. "Walking Bear," Sarah said loudly enough for the entire council to hear, "there are things about your brother's injuries that you need to understand before decisions are made about retaliation." The council fell silent as every warrior turned, their attention to the white woman who had dared to speak without permission in their most sacred political gathering. Sarah felt the weight of 200 hostile stares, knowing that her next words would either provide the opening Joseph needed for his dramatic return to life or seal her fate as the first casualty of the war that was about to begin. Red Wolf's hand moved to his tomahawk, his intention clear. If Sarah said anything that interfered with his plans for immediate military action, he would silence her permanently and claim that she had tried to deceive the council with American lies. But before either Sarah or Red Wolf could speak again, a voice emerged from the travois that froze every person in the council with shock and disbelief. "Marcus," Joseph Crowfeather said weakly but clearly, his eyes opening to focus on his cousin with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We need to discuss why you tried to have me killed 3 days ago." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind whispering through the sandstone formations around the council amphitheater. 200 Comanche warriors stared in stunned amazement at their war chief, who had apparently returned from the dead to confront his would-be assassin in front of the entire assembled council. The most dangerous part of their mission was about to begin. The resurrection of Joseph Crowfeather sent shockwaves through the war council that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Warriors who had been preparing to mourn a fallen leader found themselves staring at a man who had literally returned from the dead, while the political calculations that had been building toward war suddenly collapsed into chaos and confusion. Marcus, Red Wolf's reaction was the most telling. Instead of expressing joy at his cousin's miraculous survival, his hand tightened on his tomahawk and his face contorted with rage that revealed far more than he intended. For a split second, before he could control his expression, Red Wolf looked like a man whose carefully laid plans had been destroyed by an impossible development. "Joseph," Red Wolf said, his voice carefully modulated to suggest concern rather than anger, "we thought you were dead. How is this possible?" Joseph struggled to sit up on the travois, his movements still affected by the lingering effects of the belladonna, but his voice growing stronger with each word. "I nearly was dead, cousin, but not from the wounds I received in battle. I almost died because someone provided information about my travel route to enemies who wanted to ensure I never reached the peace negotiations." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, visible to everyone and impossible to ignore. Warriors throughout the council began murmuring among themselves, trying to process the implications of what their war chief was suggesting. Walking, Bear knelt beside his brother, his expression a mixture of relief at Joseph's survival and confusion about the circumstances of his apparent death and resurrection. "Brother, we found you near death at the White Settlement. The doctor said your injuries were beyond healing." "Dr. Mitchell saved my life," Joseph replied, his gaze finding Sarah among the crowd of warriors. "But more importantly, she helped me discover who was truly responsible for the ambush that nearly killed me." Sarah felt every eye in the council turning toward her, and she realized that Joseph was about to reveal their deception to people who would view it as either brilliant strategy or unforgivable betrayal. The next few minutes would determine whether their desperate gamble would be seen as justified by its results or punished as an insult to Comanche honor. Joseph reached into his shirt and withdrew the leather pouch containing the documents that proved Morrison's conspiracy. The papers were slightly damp from his perspiration and the effects of the medication, but they remained legible and devastating in their implications. "Marcus," Joseph said, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief addressing his council, 3 weeks ago you met with Lieutenant Daniel Morrison of the American Cavalry. You told him about our peace negotiations and provided him with detailed information about my travel schedule." Red Wolf's mask of concern slipped further, revealing the calculating intelligence that had made him such an effective war leader. "You accuse me of betraying our people to the Americans?" "I accuse you of working with Americans who want to prevent peace because they profit from continued warfare," Joseph replied, producing Morrison's correspondence from the pouch. "These documents prove that Morrison and his associates have been manipulating both sides of this conflict to ensure it continues indefinitely." The council erupted in angry voices as warriors demanded to see the evidence and understand the full scope of what their leaders were discussing. Walking Bear took the documents from Joseph's hands and began reading aloud, translating the English text into Comanche for those who couldn't understand the written language. The financial records detailing Morrison's military supply contracts drew gasps of outrage from warriors who had lost family members in what they now realized were manufactured conflicts. The correspondence discussing the manipulation of Comanche raids to justify increased military spending created a fury that Sarah could feel radiating through the crowd like heat from a forge. But it was the letter from the territorial governor, authorizing Morrison to take whatever measures proved necessary, that transformed anger into cold, deadly purpose. The assembled warriors realized they had been played like pieces in a game they hadn't even known they were part of. Red Wolf, seeing his position becoming untenable, attempted to regain control of the narrative. Even if these documents are genuine, they prove that some Americans are our enemies. They don't prove that peace negotiations will succeed or that we should trust any white promises. They prove that you've been working with those Americans to ensure peace negotiations fail, Joseph countered, his strength returning as the adrenaline of confrontation overcame the lingering effects of the medication. You've been conducting raids using my name and my authority, making it appear that I was leading attacks while I was trying to negotiate an end to the violence. The political implications of this revelation struck the council like a thunderbolt. If Red Wolf had been impersonating Joseph during raids, then every attack attributed to their war chief over the past months had actually been unauthorized actions that violated Comanche Council decisions about military strategy. Stonewolf, who had guarded Sarah during their journey, stepped forward with a document of his own. War Chief, I have carried this message from the elders of the Pennateca Band. They report that warriors claiming to act on your orders raided their territory 2 weeks ago, taking horses and weapons without permission. Additional voices joined the chorus of accusations as warriors from different bands revealed similar unauthorized raids and attacks that had been conducted in Joseph's name. A pattern emerged of systematic deception that had been designed to create conflict between Comanche groups while making peace negotiations impossible. Red Wolf found himself surrounded by increasingly hostile warriors as the full scope of his betrayal became clear. But he was too skilled a politician to surrender without attempting to salvage his position through one final, desperate gambit. Joseph speaks of peace while our children starve and our hunting grounds shrink every season, Red Wolf declared, appealing to the legitimate grievances that had made his war faction attractive to many warriors. These Americans will promise anything to avoid facing us in honest battle, but their promises are worth nothing when settlers continue to steal our land. The argument carried real weight because it addressed genuine concerns that peace negotiations alone couldn't resolve. The pressure of American expansion was indeed forcing Comanche bands into increasingly desperate circumstances, and many warriors believed that military resistance was their only hope for long-term survival. Joseph recognized the challenge and responded with a proposal that surprised everyone in the council, including Sarah. Marcus, you speak of honest battle. I propose that we settle this dispute through traditional combat. If you defeat me, the War Council will accept your leadership and your strategy. If I defeat you, you will acknowledge your betrayal and accept the consequences. The proposal for single combat between the two war chiefs created an immediate sensation throughout the council. This was a traditional method for resolving leadership disputes that carried absolute moral authority among Comanche warriors. The outcome would be viewed as a divine judgment that settled not just the personal conflict between the cousins, but the larger question of whether peace or war represented the correct path forward. Red Wolf couldn't refuse the challenge without appearing cowardly before the assembled warriors, but accepting it meant risking everything on his ability to defeat a man he had already tried to kill through treachery. His hesitation revealed the fundamental weakness in his position. He had been relying on deception and manipulation rather than the personal courage that Comanche leadership traditionally required. "You are still weak from your injuries," Red Wolf said, attempting to appear magnanimous while actually trying to avoid the combat that would expose his true character. "It would not be honorable for me to fight you in your current condition." Joseph's response demonstrated the political skill that had made him effective in peace negotiations. "Then we will wait until tomorrow's dawn. That will give me time to recover my full strength and give you time to consider whether you truly believe in the war you've been advocating." The delay served multiple purposes. It would indeed allow Joseph to recover from the effects of the belladonna and his recent injuries, but it would also give the assembled warriors time to discuss the evidence of Red Wolf's betrayal and consider the implications of choosing war over peace. As the council broke into smaller groups to debate the revelations and prepare for the next day's combat, Sarah found herself in an unexpected position of honor rather than danger. Warriors who had viewed her as a potential enemy now approached with curiosity and respect, recognizing that her medical skills and courage had been essential to exposing the conspiracy that threatened their people. Walking Bear appointed a group of trusted warriors to guard both Sarah and the documents that proved Morrison's conspiracy, ensuring that the evidence would be preserved regardless of the outcome of the combat between Joseph and Red Wolf. "Dr. Mitchell," Walking Bear said as evening shadows began to lengthen across the council amphitheater, "you have taken great risks to help our people discover the truth about those who would manipulate us into warfare. This will not be forgotten." Sarah nodded, but her attention remained focused on Joseph, who was using the gathering darkness to recover his strength for the combat that would determine the future of the frontier. Tomorrow's dawn would bring either vindication of their dangerous gamble or the final tragedy that would plunge the region into the devastating war that Morrison's conspiracy had been designed to create. As campfires were lit throughout the valley, and warriors settled into the ritual preparations that preceded important battles, Sarah realized that their 7-day countdown was entering its final phase. The choice between peace and war would be decided not by political negotiation or military strategy, but by single combat between two men whose personal conflict had become the focal point for their people's entire future. The most important fight of Joseph Crowfeather's life would begin at sunrise, and its outcome would echo across the Texas frontier for generations to come. The pre-dawn darkness hung over the council amphitheater like a shroud, broken only by the flickering flames of ceremonial fires that had burned throughout the night. Sarah had slept fitfully beside one of those fires, her dreams haunted by visions of the combat that would soon determine whether her desperate gamble to save Joseph's life would ultimately preserve peace or trigger the very war they had fought to prevent. As the first pale light began to appear on the eastern horizon, the entire Comanche Council stirred to life with the ritualistic precision of people preparing for a sacred event. Warriors began painting their faces with traditional designs that honored the spirits of war and justice, while tribal elders arranged themselves in a ceremonial circle that would serve as both witness and judge for the combat to come. Joseph emerged from the lodge where he had spent the night in meditation and physical preparation, his appearance transformed from the wounded man Sarah had treated into the embodiment of Comanche warrior tradition. His chest bore the ritual scarification that marked his achievements in battle. His hair was braided with eagle feathers that signified his status as a war chief, and his movements displayed the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the arts of mounted combat, but Sarah could see the subtle signs that revealed the cost of their deception. Joseph's left shoulder, where Morrison's bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, showed slight stiffness that could prove fatal in close combat. His breathing, while controlled and steady, carried a barely perceptible depth that suggested his lungs were still recovering from the trauma of simulated death. Most concerning of all, his eyes held a weariness that spoke of someone pushing his body beyond its natural limits. Marcus Redwolf appeared from the opposite side of the amphitheater, his own preparation for combat revealing the fundamental differences between the two cousins. Where Joseph embodied the traditional values of Comanche leadership, honor, courage, and responsibility to his people, Redwolf displayed the harder edges of someone who had embraced warfare as an end in itself rather than a means to protect his community. Redwolf's war paint was more elaborate and aggressive than Joseph's, featuring symbols that emphasized personal glory rather than tribal service. His weapons were newer and more ornate, suggesting access to resources that other warriors didn't possess. Most tellingly, his entourage included several men whose faces Sarah didn't recognize from the previous day's council, warriors who had arrived during the night and whose loyalty to Redwolf seemed based on personal obligation rather than shared political conviction. Walking Bear served as the formal announcer for the combat, his voice carrying across the amphitheater as he explained the terms that would govern the fight and its consequences. Joseph Crowfeather and Marcus Redwolf will settle their dispute through traditional combat. The winner will lead our people in the decisions that follow. The loser will accept judgment from the tribal council. The combat rules were simple, but deadly. Each warrior would be armed with a lance, a tomahawk, and a knife. They would fight on foot within a circle marked by sacred stones, and the battle would continue until one man yielded, was killed, or was rendered unable to continue fighting. There would be no interference from supporters, no mercy for weakness, and no appeal from the result. As the sun cleared the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the combat circle, Sarah realized that everything they had accomplished over the past week, saving Joseph's life, exposing Morrison's conspiracy, preventing Marcus Redwolf's unauthorized war, could be undone in the next few minutes if Joseph's injuries proved too severe for him to prevail in single combat. The two warriors entered the circle from opposite sides, their movements watched by 200 pairs of eyes that understood this moment would echo through Comanche history, regardless of its outcome. Joseph and Redwolf circled each other with the patient alertness of predators, each seeking weakness in his opponent while concealing his own vulnerabilities. Redwolf struck first, his lance darting toward Joseph's injured shoulder with the precision of someone who knew exactly where his cousin was most vulnerable. Joseph deflected the attack with his own lance, but Sarah could see the slight wince that accompanied the movement, confirming her fears about his physical condition. The early exchanges revealed the tactical approaches each warrior had chosen. Redwolf was fighting aggressively, seeking to overwhelm Joseph through sheer ferocity and end the combat before his own endurance became a factor. Joseph was fighting defensively, using his superior tactical knowledge to conserve energy while waiting for opportunities to exploit Redwolf's aggressive impulses. But as the combat progressed, it became clear that Redwolf's strategy was succeeding. Joseph's movements were becoming more labored, his reactions slightly slower, as the combination of recent injuries and the lingering effects of the belladonna took their toll on his stamina. Redwolf, sensing his advantage, pressed his attacks with increasing intensity. A particularly vicious combination of lance thrusts forced Joseph to give ground, and Redwolf's follow-up tomahawk strike came within inches of ending the fight with a killing blow to Joseph's head. Only a desperate backward leap saved Joseph's life, but the movement opened the wound in his shoulder, and Sarah could see blood beginning to seep through his shirt. The sight of Joseph's blood drew excited shouts from Redwolf's supporters, who sensed that their leader was on the verge of victory. But it also triggered something deeper in Joseph, a reservoir of determination that transcended physical limitations and drew on the spiritual strength that had made him a leader worth following. Instead of retreating further, Joseph suddenly changed tactics, abandoning his defensive approach in favor of an aggressive assault that caught Red Wolf completely off guard. Joseph's lance work became a blur of precisely targeted strikes that forced Red Wolf to retreat across the combat circle, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate realization that he had underestimated his cousin's fighting spirit. The turning point came when Red Wolf, in his eagerness to press what he thought was a winning attack, overextended himself and left his left side exposed for a split second. Joseph's lance found the opening, penetrating Red Wolf's defenses and driving deep into his opponent's ribs with a force that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing to the ground. Red Wolf attempted to rise, his hand clutching the wound that was bleeding profusely, but his legs buckled and he collapsed back to the earth with a groan that carried across the silent amphitheater. The combat was over, and Joseph Crowfeather stood victorious despite his injuries and the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. But Joseph's next action surprised everyone in the council and revealed the character that had made him a leader, worth following even unto death. Instead of claiming total victory or demanding harsh punishment for his defeated cousin, Joseph extended his hand to help Red Wolf to his feet. "Marcus," Joseph said, his voice carrying across the amphitheater, so that every warrior could hear his words, "You have fought with courage, even though you have fought for the wrong cause. Our people need that courage directed toward our real enemies, not wasted in conflicts that serve only those who would manipulate us." Red Wolf, blood streaming from his wound, but his pride intact, accepted Joseph's assistance in rising. "You have defeated me fairly, cousin. I accept your leadership and your judgment." The formal submission ended the combat phase of the crisis, but it also began the more complex process of determining what consequences would follow from Red Wolf's betrayal and what steps would be taken to address the larger conspiracy that had nearly plunged the frontier into devastating warfare. Joseph addressed the assembled council with the authority of someone who had literally returned from the dead to lead his people through their greatest crisis. "Warriors of the Comanche nation, we have learned that our real enemies are not the American settlers who seek only to build homes and raise families in peace. Our real enemies are those who profit from warfare and who manipulate both our people and theirs to ensure that killing never ends." He gestured toward Sarah, who had been watching the combat with a mixture of relief and continuing anxiety about what would happen next. "This white woman risked her life to help us discover the truth about those who would use us as weapons against our own interests. She represents the possibility that peace between our peoples can be built on mutual respect and shared benefit rather than fear and exploitation." The council's response to Joseph's words was mixed, but generally positive. Warriors who had been prepared for war found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about American intentions, while those who had supported the peace negotiations felt vindicated by the exposure of the conspiracy that had been working against them. But just as the council seemed ready to embrace Joseph's vision of peace, a scout came racing into the amphitheater on a lathered horse, his face grim with urgent news that would test their newfound unity. "War Chief," the scout called out, sliding from his horse before it had come to a complete stop. "White soldiers approach from the east. Many soldiers, riding hard and armed for war." The news sent a ripple of tension through the assembled warriors, as hands moved instinctively toward weapons and eyes turned toward Joseph for guidance. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that their moment of triumph was about to be tested by the very forces they had been fighting against. "How many soldiers?" Joseph asked, his tactical mind already assessing the threat. 40 riders, maybe," More. They follow the trail we made, bringing your body from the white settlement. The scout's breathing was labored from his desperate ride. They will reach this valley before the sun touches the western horizon. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications. Only one person could have tracked them with such precision and speed: Lieutenant Morrison, the architect of the conspiracy that had nearly cost Joseph his life. Morrison was coming to finish what he had started, to eliminate the witnesses and evidence that could expose his corruption and end his profitable manipulation of frontier warfare. Walking Bear stepped forward, his hand on his tomahawk. "Brother, these soldiers come to take our honored guest and destroy the proof of American treachery. Do we fight them or do we flee?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, visible to everyone and impossible to ignore. Joseph's answer would determine whether the peace they had just achieved would survive its first test or crumble under the weight of Morrison's desperation. Joseph's response to the approaching cavalry revealed the wisdom that had made him a leader worth following into the jaws of death itself. Instead of choosing between fight or flight, he proposed a third option that would either vindicate everything they had fought for or destroy them all in a blaze of gunfire that would echo across the frontier for generations. "We neither fight nor flee," Joseph declared, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had literally returned from the dead to lead his people. "We invite Lieutenant Morrison to come to us, and we give him exactly what he wants: the opportunity to destroy the evidence of his conspiracy in front of 200 Comanche witnesses." Walking Bear's expression reflected the confusion that rippled through the assembled warriors. "Brother, that sounds like surrender with extra steps. It sounds like the trap Morrison has been walking toward since the moment he decided to profit from our people's blood," Joseph replied, producing the leather pouch containing the damning documents. "Morrison believes he's coming to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. Instead, he's coming to provide the final proof that American leaders can be trusted to punish their own criminals." Sarah felt a chill of understanding as she grasped the full scope of Joseph's plan. By allowing Morrison to reach the council amphitheater, they would force him to reveal his true intentions in front of witnesses from both cultures. If Morrison attacked a peaceful gathering to destroy evidence of his own corruption, he would provide undeniable proof that the conspiracy was real and that American military leadership could be divided between honorable officers and criminal opportunists. "What if Morrison simply kills us all and claims we attacked his patrol?" Red Wolf asked, his tactical mind focusing on the obvious flaw in the strategy. "Then he'll have to explain to Colonel Harrison why he led an unauthorized attack on a Comanche." "Peace council without orders or justification," Joseph replied. "Morrison's power depends on maintaining plausible deniability. Mass murder of peaceful negotiators would destroy that deniability and expose him to military justice." But Sarah recognized a deeper layer to Joseph's strategy, one that addressed the fundamental challenge facing any peace process between cultures that had been manipulated into viewing each other as natural enemies. By forcing Morrison to choose between revealing his criminality and committing an act that would horrify decent people on both sides, Joseph was creating an opportunity for Americans and Comanches to unite against a common enemy. The preparations for Morrison's arrival took on the character of a carefully choreographed theatrical performance designed to maximize the dramatic impact of his choices. Warriors positioned themselves around the amphitheater to provide security without appearing threatening, while the tribal elders arranged the evidence of Morrison's conspiracy in a way that would be clearly visible to anyone entering the council area. Sarah found herself assigned a central role in the performance, positioned near the documents that proved Morrison's guilt, but also in a location where any attack on her would be witnessed by everyone present. If Morrison chose violence, his first target would necessarily be the woman whose medical skills had saved the war chief he had tried to assassinate. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the sandstone walls of the amphitheater. Morrison's cavalry patrol rode into view with the confident precision of professional soldiers who believed they held overwhelming tactical advantage over their opponents. Lieutenant Morrison himself rode at the head of the column, his uniform immaculate despite the hard ride from Cedar Ridge, his bearing reflecting the arrogance of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. Behind him rode 40 hand-picked troopers whose loyalty had been purchased through shares in the profits from his military supply contracts. But Sarah noticed something that filled her with hope rather than fear. Riding alongside Morrison, but clearly not part of his inner circle, were several cavalrymen whose faces showed confusion and concern rather than confidence. These men had apparently been told they were participating in a rescue mission or a legitimate military operation, and their expressions suggested growing doubts about their lieutenant's true motives. Morrison's shock at seeing Joseph Crow Feather, alive and standing before the assembled war council, was visible even from a distance. For several seconds, the lieutenant stared at the man he had tried to kill, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and calculating assessment of his suddenly complicated situation. "Joseph Crow Feather," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with forced authority, "you are under arrest for organizing raids against American settlements. Surrender yourself and Dr. Mitchell for transport to military custody." The accusation was both clever and desperate, attempting to transform Morrison from pursuer to law enforcement officer, while casting Joseph as a criminal rather than a victim. But the strategy revealed Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he was facing. Joseph's response demonstrated the political sophistication that had made him effective in peace negotiations. "Lieutenant Morrison, welcome to the Comanche Tribal Council. We have been discussing your recent correspondence with Marcus Red Wolf regarding the manipulation of frontier warfare for personal profit." The direct reference to the conspiracy documents sent a visible shock through Morrison's patrol, as soldiers who had believed they were serving legitimate law enforcement suddenly realized they might be participating in something far more sinister. Sarah watched as several troopers exchanged worried glances and moved their hands closer to their weapons, not to threaten the Comanches, but to prepare for potential conflict with their own officers. Morrison's next move confirmed that his back was against the wall and that he was prepared to risk everything to protect his secrets. "Dr. Mitchell," he shouted, "you are harboring a known terrorist and providing aid to enemies of the United States. Step away from those savages and place yourself under military protection." The demand was phrased to sound like a rescue attempt, but Sarah understood that Morrison was trying to separate her from the protection of the Comanche warriors so that he could eliminate both her and the evidence she carried without having to attack an entire tribal council. Sarah's response would either vindicate Joseph's faith in American justice or prove that corruption had penetrated too deeply to be rooted out through peaceful means. She stepped forward into the center of the amphitheater, the documents detailing Morrison's conspiracy clutched in her hands, and addressed not just Morrison but his entire patrol. "Soldiers of the United States Army," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 years earning respect on the frontier. "I am Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I have evidence that Lieutenant Morrison has been manipulating both American and Comanche forces to prolong warfare for his personal financial gain." The reaction among Morrison's troops was immediate and dramatic. Several men began questioning their officers directly, demanding explanations for what they were hearing. Others moved to positions that would allow them to observe the evidence. Sarah was offering while maintaining tactical flexibility, but Morrison's hardcore supporters, the men who shared in his profits and whose futures depended on his success, began to spread out in a formation that suggested they were preparing for combat. The situation balanced on a knife's edge, with American soldiers potentially about to fight other American soldiers, while 200 Comanche warriors watched to see whether justice or corruption would prevail. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the mortal danger she faced, "these documents prove that you provided intelligence to Marcus Red Wolf about Joseph Crowfeather's peace mission, that you profited from military supply contracts that required continued warfare, and that you attempted to assassinate a diplomatic negotiator." Morrison's mask of military professionalism finally slipped completely, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. "You're a traitor, Mitchell. You've been compromised by extended contact with hostiles, and you're spreading enemy propaganda to undermine American security." But his accusation carried no weight with soldiers who could see the evidence Sarah held and who had begun to understand that they had been manipulated into participating in a conspiracy against their own government's interests. Sergeant William Burke, Morrison's second-in-command, stepped forward with the grim determination of a career soldier who had discovered his trust had been betrayed. "Lieutenant, I need to see those documents the doctor mentioned. If there's evidence of wrongdoing, it's our duty to investigate." Morrison's hand moved toward his sidearm, but he found himself facing not just Burke, but a dozen other soldiers whose loyalties had shifted from personal obligation to professional duty. The conspiracy that had seemed so secure was crumbling as Morrison's own men turned against him. "Stand down, Sergeant," Morrison ordered, but his voice carried desperation rather than authority. "That's an order." "With respect, sir," Burke replied, "I don't take orders from officers who commit treason against the United States." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Morrison drew his pistol and aimed it at Sarah, apparently intending to destroy the evidence and the witness simultaneously. But before he could fire, Joseph Crowfeather's tomahawk struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying across the amphitheater floor. Morrison collapsed too, his knees clutching his wounded shoulder, while Sergeant Burke and several loyal soldiers moved to restrain him. The conspiracy that had nearly plunged the frontier into devastating warfare had been defeated not by military force or political maneuvering, but by the simple power of truth confronting corruption in front of witnesses who refused to tolerate betrayal. In the aftermath of Morrison's arrest, the real work of building peace began in earnest. Colonel Harrison, summoned by Burke's dispatch riders, arrived 2 days later to take custody of Morrison and his co-conspirators while beginning the formal negotiations that would establish lasting agreements between American and Comanche leadership. The peace treaty that emerged from those negotiations bore the influence of everything Sarah and Joseph had experienced during their week-long ordeal. It included provisions for joint investigation of future conflicts, mechanisms for cultural exchange and mutual understanding, and protections against the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed both peoples. Sarah found herself appointed as the first official liaison between American medical services and Comanche healing traditions, a position that allowed her to continue the bridge-building work that had begun when she chose to save a wounded stranger's life. Joseph Crowfeather became the primary Comanche representative in the ongoing peace process. His experience with American treachery and American honor providing the wisdom necessary to distinguish between reliable and unreliable partners in future negotiations. 6 months later, as Sarah stood on the porch of her expanded medical practice in Cedar Ridge, she watched a group of Comanche children receiving vaccination against smallpox from a joint American Comanche medical team. The site represented everything they had fought to achieve: cooperation replacing conflict, trust replacing suspicion, and hope replacing the endless cycle of violence that had defined the frontier for so long. The 7 days that had begun with a simple medical emergency had indeed changed everything, proving that sometimes the most important healing requires not just treating wounds, but mending the divisions between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies rather than potential allies in building a better future for all. Walking. Bear, now serving as Joseph's chief deputy in the peace process, approached her with a letter bearing official seals from both governments. "Dr. Mitchell," he said with the formal respect that had replaced his initial suspicion, "the Joint Council has approved your proposal for the Frontier Medical College. You'll be training both American and Comanche healers in techniques that combine the best of both traditions." Sarah accepted the letter with hands that no longer trembled when faced with impossible challenges. The woman who had once fled Boston to escape scandal had found her true calling on the Texas frontier, not just as a healer of bodies, but as a builder of bridges between cultures that had been manipulated into forgetting their common humanity. The future remains uncertain, as futures always do, but it was a future built on truth rather than lies, cooperation rather than exploitation, and the courage of individuals who chose to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. And that, Sarah reflected, was the strongest foundation any peace could have. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.